You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Low back pain is probably the most common musculoskeletal complaint in the modern world. But you know this, we've talked about it on the podcast before. What you might not know is that an estimated 25% of people with low back pain are more specifically experiencing sacroiliac joint pain, where the spine and the back of the pelvis meet. Well, today's guest on the podcast has recently completed her capstone research project for the Yoga Medicine 1,000-hour teacher training qualification, investigating whether yoga tools and techniques, more specifically self-myofascial release, can be helpful to reduce or alleviate SI joint pain. I'm talking to yoga studio owner, Yoga Alliance continued education provider, and Yoga Medicine Therapeutic Specialist, Kelsea Wright, who is now Yoga Medicine's third 1,000-hour qualified teacher. Kelsea has a master's in education and spent 10 years teaching kindergarten in the public school system before completing her 200-hour yoga teacher training. Since then, as well as opening Limitless Yoga Studio in Wichita, Kansas, she has amassed almost 8,000 hours of yoga teaching. So today, Kelsea walks us through what she learned in her 1,000-hour project, including which yoga tools and techniques are the most helpful. So let's tackle sacroiliac joint pain with Kelsea Wright. Hi, Kelsea. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, and a huge congratulations on completing your 1,000-hour project and your certification.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Yay! So we're here today to talk about your capstone research project, which honed in on low back pain generally and sacroiliac pain more specifically. And before we kind of go through some of the background of what you did in your project, maybe we start by talking about what it was about that topic that got you intrigued to begin with.
Okay. So lower back pain has always been near and dear to my heart because I actually suffered an SI
It's a nice way to frame it.
A while back, many years ago, I was jogging on a treadmill and I had not warmed up properly. So there's that. But I had this injury and I basically was just bouncing between doctors and physical therapists and pain pills and exercises, and it just lasted for years. And I was at the point where I was just so frustrated because I felt like there was no way that this should be my life. I always had the fear of a flare up and something that was going to come up. So I lived with that for a long time. So my heart went out to anybody in that chronic pain. But I specifically wanted to make sure that since I was going to put a lot of time and energy into this, I wanted to serve my students best. So I did put out a survey to my students first, just to make sure that was something they were interested in. And I just had a sheet that had a couple different ailments on it, things like head, neck, and shoulder pain, low back pain, but also, trouble sleeping, anxiety. And after all the votes came in, it was definitely team low back for the win. Yeah. So it was just kind of the stars aligned. It was perfect. It was something I was very passionate about and really wanted to help people with. And it was something my students definitely needed help with. So everything came together, and that was my topic.
Yeah. And I think it is that thing that we've all heard the statistics, somewhere between 80 and 90% of all human beings in the modern world will experience low back pain at some point. And I also think It's one of those areas that, exactly as you said, flares up and niggles and doesn't always respond really neatly and in a linear way to treatment. And it can invoke a lot of fear and anxiety. And that question that you posed of, is this actually going to be my life now? I didn't think this was going to be my life. I didn't think I was going to be a person who had to deal with that sort of thing. So yeah, I can see why that topic was close to your heart. Lovely way to phrase it, and resonated with so many of your students too.
If you've never had low back pain, congratulations.
Yeah,
We're
step
all very
one, go
jealous.
you.
We're all very jealous. But if you have at all, like it basically affects every aspect of your life because your weight is traveling, your upper body is traveling through your lower body, and
Mhm.
whether you're sitting, sleeping, standing, exercising, no matter if you're in movement or in stillness, your low back is affected. So there's nothing that you can escape. It's not necessarily like you sprained your ankle and if you prop it up, it feels better. If you ice it, it feels better. The low back is just something that is just constantly there, and it takes up so much time and energy to have this constant achiness and this fear of what's going to make it flare up today, and if I bend over and pick up my kid, or if I slip on the ice, or if I pick up something or sit down wrong or
Roll
sleep
over
wrong.
in bed funny.
Exactly. It's just going to be this whole huge cycle. So there's never, you have good days and you have bad days, but even on the good days, you're still obsessed with it could be a bad day at any moment, depending on what I do. And you don't know what's going to create that pain and that tension. So yeah, definitely. It's something that it's not just a normal ache and pain. It's kind of all consuming.
Yeah, and when you got into your research project, it turned out that the majority of your students were dealing less with lumbar low back pain and more with sacroiliac pain. So we'll hone in a little more on the sacroiliac joints as our conversation progresses. But maybe you tell us a little background about what the research project looked like, what its structure was.
Well, I knew that for me personally, even though I did physical therapy and multiple times, and I did a lot of exercises, it was helpful, but there was always still just something there.
Mm.
And so I found yoga unwillingly. I was dragged into my first class. I thought it was going to be boring and it was going to be challenging, and then I left. Happily, I was wrong. I was very wrong about that. And that actually started to very much help my low back, but there was just a little bit of something there, even after all the yoga that I was taking. So I finally found myofascial release through yoga medicine, their module, and it was just that silver bullet. It cleared out everything. And not only did it, permanently fix my low back pain, but I also knew that I had this toolbox of things that I could draw upon. So if I ever did have a flare up, which sometimes can happen, you knew how to address it. So you didn't live in that fear of, oh my gosh, what's going to make this good day a bad day. So once I knew that myofascial release was my silver bullet, I knew I needed that to be a part of the research project. So I basically had 20 participants, split them into two groups. They were going to receive the exact same yoga classes and strengthening homework. So everything was identical, but one group of 10 was going to receive myofascial release training. So they would add that to their homework. And then at the end, we were going to compare all the results of the intake form, which was a lot of the orthopedic tests and palpation and pain levels. And then we were going to compare that with kind of the exit exam at the end, and see what would happen. I mean, I was 100% convinced that myofascial release was going to be the best thing. Was going to be the best thing ever. So I had no doubts in my mind
This
that
sounds
this was going to
very
be
dangerous for a researcher to be going in 100% sure.
absolutely, absolutely. Because I had a lot of students asking questions about it and stuff, and I really had to maintain this neutral stance of like, well, we're going to see, and and in the back of your mind, you're like, go MFR.
Well, this is exactly why you're a yoga teacher and a yoga studio owner and not a scientific researcher. Fair enough.
I'll let them have that area of expertise.
Exactly. Great. So you took everybody through a detailed intake process. You gathered a lot of information from them about their situation, what made it better, what made it worse, what the severity was, how long they'd had it, what previous treatment that they'd had, and some investigation too around their beliefs around it, and how they were handling it. All of that really important relationship building stuff. And then everybody had a similar movement program that involved some strengthening and stabilization, because that's usually what we see. If we Google, what do I do for low back pain? It's usually something to do with stability and strength around the center of the body. And then your second group had the icing on the cake, a myofascial release intervention as well. Great.
Yeah.
What I wanted to hone in on this conversation was that you took this sort of three-pronged approach. And the first part of the approach is something that we've talked about, but we perhaps haven't spelled out how transformational it can be to people's experience of pain. And that was pain education or pain care. For both of your
Yes.
groups, you shared quite a bit of information about pain science. And you mentioned when you were presenting your project that even some of the questions that you asked in the intake process, like tell me about your posture when you sleep, or, how do you position yourself to work? You could see starting to twig little thoughts in people's minds of, oh, hey now, yes, I do, garden for 5 hours every weekend, and my back is more sore after that. Or I do sit for work, and it is usually more sore after sitting for work. Already that was starting to create changes in the way that they viewed their pain. So let's talk about the pain education side and explain what you did there.
Well, I'm someone that believes that the more information you have about how everything works, um, the more your brain gets on board with it. There's
This
a
could
lot of
be
people
your
that,
education background speaking.
yes, yes, no, I was a kindergarten teacher for 10 years. So um, I was always breaking things down into little bite-sized pieces so that they could, chew on it, digest it, and then it brings into we put all those puzzle pieces together, and then you get
Mhm.
something, a big mural at the end. And um, for for these students that were coming in, they had anywhere from a year to upwards of 15 years of pain, and so a lot of them, they just came very downcast, and they were just very, this is me, and this is kind of my last resort. And they just kind of assume that it is what it is. And I got a lot of, negative talk. And this is my bad hip. I'm broken. I'm just getting old was a very common one. This is my body breaking down. And so I definitely wanted to start each class in the research project with just a little bit of information, um, for them to kind of chew on through class, and that would kind of almost be a theme through the class, something that could really start to change their mind towards a healing process, towards something positive. So the very first class, we talked about how the brain receives signals, and how those signals can get muddled. And we talked about how trauma in your life, and when you say the word trauma, everybody immediately thinks of like something very big and dramatic, and a car crash or something. And trauma is completely up to you, and how your brain and body take it. But any little things throughout your life are going to kind of put these filters into place, and then that information has to go through those filters. So sometimes by the time it reaches the brain, it's waters have been muddied to the point where you're not necessarily receiving that crystal clear signal. We kind of compared it to when you have bad reception on your phone. If you're out in the middle of nowhere with your cell phone, you're not getting good reception. And so we wanted to really make sure that we were going to connect and have that good reception up and down the body, so that what we were feeling in the class and what we were doing and how we were influencing the tissues was actually going to get up to the brain, and the brain was going to recognize, oh, by the way, this is different. Like, I haven't felt that in 15 years, or like it is actually kind of changing. So I'm going to go ahead and put some resources to that and actually speed up the healing process. So once they realized that they didn't have to be in this situation, and they could actively be part of the solution just by simple things like thinking positively, and monitoring their seated position and posture. Once they realized that that was something very simple that they could do throughout their day without the teacher telling them what to do, and without taking a pill, you could just see this whole switch in positivity, and these little lights came on in their eyes, like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not a broken human anymore. Maybe I can do some things that will actually get me out of pain. So we definitely spent just a little bit of time with each class working on this, just a little bit of information to chew on, for them to help decide, by the way, I'm an active participant in this, and I can help heal myself with just these little small things that maybe they hadn't thought of before.
I love that so much. And I think the real key there for people who are thinking of incorporating this into their teaching is the bite-sized chunks, because all of our pain processing and interpretation is filtered through, as you said, layer upon layer of beliefs and experiences. You're just not going to break through that with one lecture, no matter how beautifully done it is. So you really need to be patient, don't you? And drop a little seed, let that find its way in. Next session, drop another little seed, let it find its way in. Even just asking them questions that you then allow them to finish the responses to, like, notice if anything feels different. Notice if you're having an experience that's new. That can be a lovely way to kind of break through these really, 15 years in some cases worth of very ingrained beliefs about this being their reality, and allowing those beliefs to dissolve and dissipate slowly and gently, and for them to find a place that's a little more open, and that feeling of power, that if it doesn't have to be this way, then maybe there are some actions that I can take, and this just isn't my future.
Yeah. I think the big point of that is that they felt in charge. Like
Yes.
they were taking charge of their pain. It wasn't them taking a pill that they had been prescribed. It wasn't them you know doing certain protocols that someone had given them and said, well, just go do this and let me know how you go. It was them taking an active role in, I am going to monitor my posture, and I am going to try this different way of sleeping, because I'm a side sleeper. So I'm going to put a blanket between my legs. And, I do actually stand for my job most of the time. So I'm going to start working on, how my pelvis is. So it's just these things that they can actively do that, throughout their day, and just even little small things. And I told them that it's the things that it's not necessarily the things that you're going to be doing in class that are going to make the biggest difference. It's going to be the things that you take away from class and apply for the rest of your day, because you're with me an hour a week. You're with your body the whole rest of the time.
Mhm.
So you're going to have to start getting comfortable retraining and re-educating your body, and getting him or her to a place, where they're actually healing and recognizing that they're healing, being excited about it, and seeing those results.
I love this. And I think this is a really important part of the puzzle. I'm so glad that you did it with both groups, because pain re-education itself can really alter people's experience even of a long-term injury. So I'm glad that that didn't muddy the waters with myofascial release, but was given to both groups. And even
Yes.
just the questions that you were asking in the intake process really set a fertile foundation for that pain science education to land in, because right away they were thinking, oh, wait, how I sit at work could influence my pain, how I sleep could influence my pain. Oh,
I
wow.
just
So
don't.
maybe I could,
Yeah.
yeah.
I just don't think anybody had ever, really taken the time to ask those questions before, because all of them had seen previous, medical professionals. They went to physical therapists. They tried massage therapy, acupuncture, chiropractor, all these kind of things. And I just don't think. I mean, sometimes a little bit due to our medical system here in America, you don't have that long with a doctor, and they hear you and they diagnose you, and you're out the door, and there's not necessarily that time for the pain education and well, talk to me about how you're sleeping and how you're, some of the questions in the intake, besides the position where you're sleeping with, was, what are your hobbies? What accounts for your movement, not just at work? So I had someone that they were in a bowling league like 3 times a week. So they were constantly putting all their weight through one hip. I had her show me, I was like, can you stand up and bowl for me? Because I'm not a bowler. And then she showed me, I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense why that hip is doing it. I had a skateboarder. I was like, I don't know how to skateboard. Will you show me what that looks like? And just to see how skewed their back was when they're putting all the weight through their foot. I had a tattoo artist, that I had a chef. I had so many of these different people that,
Uh-huh.
I was like, tell me about your job. Tell me the positions that you're in. And then also the hobbies. Do you like to sit and read for 3 hours on the couch, all snuggled up with your knees bent and your feet tucked under you? All these kind of things. Once they really started digging into how they spend their time and the positions that their body is in during that time, you could definitely see these kind of little lights going on, and like, oh, I'm kind of doing this to myself in certain instances. So it really did start to get the wheels turning even before we started the research project of, there actually are things that I can do even without, this intervention, to start to help, myself get in a better position, like biomechanically, and then once we strengthen what we need to strengthen, it was just even more, frosting on the cake. But definitely the intake, to give them to have that one-on-one time and really go through, what are the movements of your day, what movements hurt, what do you look like for most of the time you're at work, like show me your desk setup. I had a student that would like sit with a leg tucked up underneath them. I had one that would sit, they had like a filing cabinet between their legs, like is how they sat. So just things like that, that for some reason for them that was very comfortable. And I'm
Mm.
like, I had my little skeleton, and I'm like, I want to show you what your thigh bones look like when you do this, and how this, I started to show them, like, oh, Okay.
I love this conversation, and I think this is really important to bring people's attention to. And, there are some patterns in work that we can't change. A chef is always going to have to bend over a kitchen counter to some extent. A tattoo artist is always going to have to bend over a human to some extent. But just noticing that this is a load that my body is being adapted to. When can I give it some refreshment and variety, even if it's just a momentary pause? Stand up, change your posture, shift the load, take a breath, and then come back into it. Even that can make a difference. And then, of course, everything else you do when you're not working can also make a difference. And it might be something that influences the choices you make when you're in a flare-up situation of, okay, I'm going to really pay attention this week of how I'm sitting at work and try to sit with a little more symmetry and balance. And when my back's feeling better, maybe I don't have to be quite so careful about my posture. But just giving people things that they can control, things that they can have some power over, is such an underestimated tool. So I love that.
Yeah.
I love all of that, the pain science, the postural awareness. Let's talk about the strength and stability side, because again, this was something that was done by both groups in your study. What were some of the key poses or practices or regions of the body that you focused on?
So we mainly strengthened the kind of the pillars of support around the spine and the hips. So you're talking definitely transverse abdominis, TVA. If you ask any of the people that were in my class, they for sure know where that is now. They're very familiar with it and what it can do to help them. They probably heard me say TVA like 8 trillion times throughout the study. But we worked TVA, we worked glute med, the lower glute max, and how it's so very different than the upper glute max. A lot of people kind of just assume your butt is your butt and it's a muscle and it just does its thing. And then QL, and then the erectors and multifidus
Yeah, you've
were the
hit all
main.
my favorite muscles there straight away. Yeah. And a huge part of it is just for people, you've hit the nail on the head, knowing that those muscles exist and knowing that what we do throughout our day is requiring those muscles to work, sometimes in
Yeah.
really balanced ways, but often in some of the postural patterns and work situations that you were describing, they need to work in imbalanced ways. And so there are things that we can do to help redress the balance and to give the body a little bit more symmetry in its structural supports.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I asked all of the students afterwards in the exit interview was, what was your aha moment, or what was something that was really truly helpful, something that at that moment it was a turning point. And I was expecting kind of across the board different answers, but almost every single person were the same answers of TVA work and how it influences like how they stand, how they sit, like and then kind of when I explained the biomechanics of the body, like this muscle, even though it's over here on the side, doesn't any it's not even close to your low back. This is how it influences the low back, because it's your stability, and it doesn't allow you to let your low back be all herky jerky through the day. It actually, it's like a corset, kind of pins it into place. And so when you can relate to them in those kind of terms, they're like, oh, okay, that actually makes sense. Because sometimes I know with doctors or physical therapists, you're given exercises, but you're never really told why you're doing them. They're just like, do this, and here's your homework, and bye. And I think there's a lot of power in knowing exactly why you're doing what you're doing, and why it's important to do it as well, because it's really easy not to do your homework and not to do those exercises when you don't immediately see results. So like an exercise like clamshells, to explain, by the way, that is a glute med exercise, and it is going to help support the low back so it doesn't move, and especially with that SI joint. Like, it's really going to help shore everything up. And they're like, okay, well, this makes sense. This, I'm definitely going to do my homework because I want that benefit. And then you explain, TVA is going to help you from dumping into the low back. It's going to help pull everything up, make your low back more neutral. It's going to help support any kind of sitting or standing postures. It's going to keep everything hugged in. And then once you explain that, and once they feel it, they're just kind of like, okay, this actually makes sense. I had lots of people telling me that they were practicing kind of those TVA contractions throughout the day, because they would notice when they were standing, their low back would start to hurt, and they were kind of dumping into their low back, and they were just allowing that, that anterior tilt of the pelvis that we're also familiar with, because the body just kind of wants to do that. So like I had a teacher that had recess duty. And so very much during that 20 minutes of recess duty, she was standing there and she was feeling her low back ache. So then she started to work that TVA contraction. She's like, oh, it feels so much better. So just
Mm.
things like that throughout the day, they were working those exercises and using those biomechanics to feel better throughout the day. So again, it's another way to feel powerful and to know that
Yes.
you're influencing your pain. So
Yeah. And
definitely.
I want to touch in on that part because we've had a whole podcast on low back pain, and the research on abdominal core muscles is it's definitely not as supportive for working those muscles, improving low back pain as we used to think it was. It used to be the first remedy was, oh, you've got a sore low back, work your core. And so I think there's been a lot of questioning in the past few years of is core work even important? And you hit on the thing that I think is most important, that it made people feel strong, stable, powerful. It made people feel like they could be more aware of their posture and able to change and shift their posture. So I think there's a real tendency when we become more evidence-based to sometimes throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like we've tested everyone and now we don't think core work is as important for low back pain as we thought. But when you asked your students, that was the standout exercise for the majority of them. This is the one that I find the most helpful. This is where I feel the strongest and the most in control of my pain. So I really want to make sure that everybody hears that research is fantastic, being evidence-based is awesome, but don't throw away the evidence of your students' subjective experience. And if they find an exercise powerful, helpful, supportive, stabilizing, give them that exercise to do and help them unpack the why, as you said, so that they're, committed and involved in their healing process.
I do think it's important to, I mean, people say core work, and working individually with yoga therapy clients for a while, very few of them actually know how to activate their TVA. So many times
Sure.
when you say core, it's your six pack. This
Crunches.
is how you do crunches, and even when they're doing six pack crunches, you can see the kind of that poof of the belly that's happening, and they're so desperate to get that core work in,
I feel
and it's
attacked
just
right now. I'm just going to say it. I'm feeling attacked right now. No, it's absolutely true.
everyone thinks core is six pack, and I always tell my students, I'm like, look, six packs are pretty, but they're not exactly as functional as as the TVA. Like we really would rather focus on this, and then six pack later. We'll worry about him later. But that TVA of finding your hip points and finding that very different contraction, because
Yes.
it's not what you expect when you feel it. And a lot of people also, when you say there's these very blurry cues of engage the
Engage
core,
your
zip up
core.
the core. Yeah, and a lot of people just hold their breath. They go, and they just kind of draw their belly in like they've been punched. And there's not, cueing is so important when it comes to, or like feeling those muscles is so important, because there's so many different ways to engage your core. They're just incorrect. They think they're doing it correctly. I guess that's the biggest issue, is that they're doing all this core work, and in their mind they're doing it correctly, and therefore when they're not seeing the results and maybe their back pain isn't going away, they get even more frustrated with the whole system, and they're like, screw it, this is me, it is what it is, and they just kind of give up on
Yeah.
another time.
I think every kind of core work is helpful for something. Every kind of core work leads into a better function in some exercise. Like you think if you're a gymnast, you want a completely ripped six pack because of all the active piking that you do with your hips. But you're so right. For the average human being, getting in touch with that deeper mindfulness muscle, that more subtle engagement, that sense of connection between the ribs and the pelvis that you can use in any shape, in any position, it's not really core work the way that we've been programmed to think about it, is it? It's this connection to the very center of the body. And I love that that's the one that people felt really drawn to.
Yes, that was definitely, answer after answer after answer was, not, we did a lot of, so we did, TVA taps from the back.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did, dead bugs, of course, to add in the levers of the arms to make it a little more challenging. But then we would use that same activation, and when we flipped over to, bird dog, and we would use that
Yes.
same kind of activation when we would do, warrior three. And so, and cobra is everything. Like we're constantly talking about that. So realize that it wasn't just something that you engaged when you were working it. It was something that was actually crucial to engage like 24/7. So if you could, get your brain wrapped around the idea of, always having this muscle support you, I think that was kind of the kicker of, once I've got this, belt of support. And I compared it to, you see weightlifters put on those big leather belts, and you see, people that have to lift heavy loads like movers, they strap on those big heavy belts. I'm like, you have a natural one of those in your body. We just aren't necessarily familiar with it. So, the sides of the belt being the glute medius and the front of the belt being that TVA. I'm like, if you can work on this belt that you naturally have, you don't need that other belt because a lot of them were using those, just to support themselves, make their back pain a little bit better. So to have this idea that you always have the support, you just have to know how to, kind of turn the key and make it work correctly.
Yeah, I love that.
They would have the power to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where the action that you learn in the short term may not be the action that you need forever. So there'll be a time for all of these people where they are comfortable and supported, say lying on their back doing breath work, where they can really deliberately relax transverse abdominis and let the belly soften and expand. But often when you're teaching something that's new for people, as you understand from breaking education down into those bite-sized chunks, sometimes you've got to teach an action, learn that action, get to apply that action so often that it becomes an unconscious thing that you can call on when you need it and relax it when you don't. I love that. I think that's a fantastic approach. And you hit on all my favorite muscles. I love it. So let's shift gears and talk about the myofascial release component, which is where your two groups really differed. So what were your key myofascial release practices, and what approach did you use to employ those?
So basically, we had everybody together, we did the class, and throughout the movement portion of the class, the homework was introduced. So everybody was going to do clamshells, everybody's going to do TVA taps, everybody's going to do bird dog. They had their homework. And then when that was done, the first group, Group A, went ahead and left, and Group B stayed in the room for myofascial release, which of course really annoyed Group A because they're all like,
totally.
what's going on in there?
That would be me. It would be my little snout pressed up against the window going, what is the Group B getting that I'm not getting?
They were one even asked, well, I'm actually writing with that person, so can I just stay in here and and watch what you're doing? And I'm like, I'm so sorry.
Wait in the car.
Sorry, but no. So you could just tell, there was, at the wall, hoping they could catch what magic we were doing in there afterwards. But the first class, I just talked kind of the general idea of myofascial release and why we do it and why it's helpful, and kind of, the idea of where fascia is in the body and how, those collagen fibers can get built up into those, knots that we feel in the muscles. So just a little bit of information of why we're doing this and not just a, hey, do it and bye. So they're kind of understanding, the whole reason for this research project. And then we introduced the very first one was a spinal roll, which I'm so addicted to a good spinal roll. I tell people, like, if there's one that they can do every day, it's such a good little refresher. Not only, there's like that neurological concept of, like, I tell people is that you bring your body and mind online together, like your software and your hardware get connected when you do that. So we did a spinal roll, and you could just tell afterwards, there's the moaning and the groaning of, oh, this feels so good, and oh my gosh, that's crazy. And you talked about finding the intensity levels and to breathe through them. There was the whole training of how to do myofascial release. And then after the spinal rolls, everybody left like kind of with a smile on their face, and they were loving it. And of course, I had to really hold back and, yep, that's what we're going to be doing. Do your homework.
We'll just see how it feels. We'll just see how it goes. No promises.
How this all works out in the end. But even after that first spinal roll, people were like, I felt something that I haven't felt before. Like, things started to shift, and they could see differences in the tissues. So, of course, that's always a good sign after the first, 3 minutes of myofascial release, and we've got 8 weeks of it to go. So we did the spinal roll first, and then the idea was that you kept that for 2 weeks, And then when you came back the next time, I added another one and you dropped the first one. So there was always 2 myofascial releases that you were doing, and everything was done for 2 weeks. So we started with the spinal roll. And then on the second week, we added, after the spinal roll in, we went down to the upper glutes and worked the upper glute fibers. And, this is kind of that point of education where it's like, by the way, these guys tend to get bullied because everybody loves to use these guys instead of the lower glutes. So they tend to be a lot grumpier than
And I mean,
anywhere
you
else.
saying that and them feeling that, those two things going together can really change people's experience. Because I've had that happen before where I'm talking about the difference in activity and, fiber type between upper glute max and lower glute max. And then you get people to roll them and they're like, I feel the difference. I can feel the difference in the quality of the tissues and the intensity of the sensation and the texture, the timbre of the tissues. And that can really bring things home to people through the lens of their own experience.
Yes, especially like because of how the upper glute is so close to that SI joint, just kind of hugging in on that tailbone. I'm like, you've got these muscles that are overworking, that are kind of squeezing and giving this guy a bear hug, and that's not what he needs. So once we released him, and I was like, lay back down and then just notice your low back and notice what's going on. And you just kind of saw these smiles, and you're like, it feels like I've got a flat tire, or it feels like I have a tailbone all of a sudden, like they could just feel more of the structure of their spine because the glutes weren't sitting there grabbing a hold of it so fiercely. So they definitely enjoyed that one, even though, you get the moans, the groans because of how the deep tissue massage feeling it is. So then after the upper glutes, we did the piriformis, and this one is actually the one that absolutely cleared up my pain specifically. So I knew I definitely wanted to include it. I know that sometimes the piriformis is blamed too often. Sometimes they just automatically assume you've got.
Sometimes because it's true.
I mean, he's kind of earned that reputation. With how we sit, and we like to cross our legs all the time and stuff. So he's definitely earned a little bit of that reputation. But we did the piriformis as well, and there's another big shift of you could just tell certain moves just resonated with certain people, and they were like, this was the game changer, just like piriformis was for me. But getting all of them to do all of it and get all of the tissues just made it so much more brilliant. But we did piriformis on both sides, and then we did glute med. And I knew I wanted glute med specifically because when we did the intake form on the palpation, it was the most tender. Everybody was giving like 6s and 7s whenever I would hit that. And it's a muscle definitely that you don't necessarily think about when you think about low back health or SI joint issues, just because it is kind of so far away from it. But this one was so tender on most people that I didn't even do it on the floor. We went to the wall so that they had a little bit less weight and a little bit more control. And so they were able to.
I think that one's so important. I'm really glad you highlighted that, because I think people forget that glute med is probably principally responsible for the symmetry of the two sides of the pelvis, especially when we're standing. And if that's the base that your spine is building from, obviously that's going to influence how the low back feels. It's going to influence the level of tension on the two sides of the sacrum. So I'm so glad you included that one. But that experience, I think, is really common of, it's really helpful, but that doesn't mean it feels great, especially when you're lying on it with full body weight.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes it's really hard just to relax and get comfortable. And that one of the biggest things that I was guiding them through on each release was, you want to wait for the intensity to be taken down a few notches. So as you're breathing through this, your body has to know that this is positive and therapeutic. If you breathe shallowly, or if you're like grimacing or, making all sorts of noises, sometimes the body's going to interpret that as a threat, and it's going to tense up and actually kind of push the tennis balls or the myofascial release balls out of the tissue. So it's really important to relax. And if you're sitting there ready to tap out, you're just not going to be able to relax. So I even had one person that just the tennis ball was too much. So we wrapped the tennis ball in a sock, and she wore thick sweats, and that was still too much. So we ended up having to do like the big gray center ball, and that was just about right for her. But I would have hated to think, if she went to a massage therapist and someone pushed down with force, she would have flown off the table.
Yeah.
So like, Another reason why I love myofascial release is itself myofascial release. Like you're able to do it yourself. You know your own intensity. You know your own. You know your own body. You're so much more able to talk yourself into be like, this is okay. I'm okay. This is all going to
And
be
this is
okay.
another place where you're handing control back to the students, where they're in charge of the exact location, the intensity, the duration. They're in charge of their breath and their internal responses to it. And the more involved and engaged they are in their sensation and the protocols that they follow, the better the outcomes tend to be. Because instead of handing agency over to other people, they're the person creating the shift and the change. They're the person deciding it. And you just can't put a price on taking charge of your own well-being. Yeah, and I think this is another place where I think a lot of people who train with yoga medicine get so excited about the anatomy and the therapeutic application that a lot of us start to think, what other training could I do? Gosh, I wish I was a physical therapist, or I wish I was a doctor and I had that background. But for me, this is another really wonderful benefit of inhabiting a space that isn't their healthcare provider, where we aren't qualified to inflict pain on people. We can't diagnose, we can't treat. So we really are just guiding them through an experience and asking them to notice which tissues are more tender. Can they find a version of that that's comfortable enough that they can relax into it? Does that mean more padding or less body weight? Does that mean more body weight and less padding? And to me, that space that people inhabit when we are guiding them through an experience we're familiar with, but we're not the expert and we're not fixing them, really puts them in quite a different place. And for people that you're working with who've been through multiple different treatment modalities, a lot of them have not had success, why not try an approach where you're not the expert and you're offering some options and they're really engaged in deciding which one of those feel the most helpful?
Yes, because half of my students, half of the research students were my actual students. They were regular practitioners, but I had half that had never done yoga before. So my yogis obviously were a little bit more in tune with their body. This other half, no idea. Like they had absolutely no idea about mindfulness and that mind body connection and trying to have proprioception, and so it was a whole new thing for them. So when I would guide them through, you could just kind of see them becoming more and more familiar with their body and just how powerful that was of like knowing where your body's in space and what muscles I need to move things. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, like I'm not just a mindless robot anymore. I actually have control over everything and I can influence things. So it was definitely this kind of eye-opening moment for the ones that hadn't done yoga before, that didn't realize just how much of their body had kind of become dormant. Or they had kind of lost track of, your brain puts things on the back burner when you don't use them, or, when you haven't utilized them for a while. So it was definitely, they're kind of like, that's what this yoga thing's.
I love myofascial release for this, particularly for the normal, the average population. And I also love it for the yoga population, because we know what we're doing in Bird Dog or Dead Bug or Warrior 3 in theory, but you introduce a novel stimulus like myofascial release where there's really targeted pressure on one set of tissues, and in the one that you did first, rolling down either side of the spine, you've got this really specific feedback mechanism, this really tactile feedback of how do those tissues feel, how do the two sides compare, how does that location compare to the one that was higher up and the one that's lower down. So it gives everyone this really clear, almost external feedback device to help them explore and explain and unpack their experience. It's such a powerful embodiment tool, isn't it?
Yes, it
so
is.
we got through to piriformis. We did the spinal roll, we did upper glute max, we did piriformis, glute med. That's right. And then what were your other areas?
Okay. QL was next, and we did that at the wall. We went over the hip crest, up the spine, and across that low rib. And that one, of course, QLs for people that sit most of their day do tend to get shortened and kind of weakened. So that was definitely a gold mine along that line. And then it was the IT band as well. A lot of people, again, since it's kind of far away from the area of pain, they kind of forget how it influences it. And then finally we finished with psoas. So, which I did ask everybody at the end, like, what was the one, or I the group that had myofascial release, like what was the one that was, so powerful to you? And it was interesting to see how, even though almost everybody had SI joint pain, everybody had a different answer for what was the most productive.
I really like the approach. Obviously, I love all of the locations that you targeted, and I like the approach of keeping each practice for 2 weeks and then replacing the oldest practice with a new one and then keeping it for 2 weeks and so on, because it means that they got multiple chances to kind of refine their technique. Because sometimes you teach myofascial release, people go away and do it at home and they kind of forget the details, or they roll off the targeted tissue onto somewhere else. So it gives you a chance to kind of clean things up and refine them, but it also gives them a range of tools in their toolkit. Because I have had exactly the same experience with myofascial release, where the magic spot for me isn't helpful for somebody else, even if they have pain in the same location or from the same movement. So kind of giving people a range of things in their toolkit that they can draw on, and they can choose which is the most helpful or important. So powerful.
And I made sure to tell them that, everything's not going to work for everybody in this room. Like, you're going to find something that resonates with you, and that's for sure going to be helpful. However, you do now have this toolkit so that if you do slip on the ice, or if you do sleep wrong, you have all of this knowledge now to help yourself. So maybe, right now, psoas is not helpful, but you start training for a marathon or something.
Yeah,
Very
things might change.
helpful.
Yeah.
So right now it might not feel as productive as you want it for your low back pain currently. However, it is something important to keep in mind so that you do have the ability to, draw upon all that knowledge whenever you need it in the future, which again helps you feel more comfortable about flare-ups and things that might happen, because you now have the ability to fix yourself.
Because that's the thing, is life is going to life. We're all going to tweak something, have a niggle, turn funny, sleep funny. Life is going to continue to life. But when you can take the catastrophization out of the equation, it's not, oh my God, this is that thing starting again. It's just, my back's a little tender today, or my hip's kind of weird today. That is a whole different scenario, not just for your body, but for your brain, to not be then hyper aware of every signal coming from that area, and twice as likely to interpret it as pain as opposed to just a feeling of weirdness or a feeling of tension. Yeah, giving people tools for the future and assuring them that stuff's going to happen, because that's how bodies are and that's how life is. But it doesn't mean that you're going to be back to square one again. You've got tools in your toolkit, and things come, things go. I love that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the results.
Okay. So, by the huge smile on my face to this whole thing, hopefully you have, you've already figured out the answer. No, we had, it was overwhelmingly positive towards the myofascial release. Both sets of students, both progressed, both had far less pain numbers, but definitely you saw way more zeros, I guess, in the group B. I asked them the difference. I said, I want you to differentiate your pain, because a lot of people, they're like, I'm just in so much amount of pain, and they just kind of assume their pain is their pain. And I asked them, I want an average of your day, and then I want you to really think specifically about when you're sleeping, when you're standing, and when you are sitting. And sometimes, just that alone, that thought process of, okay, I need to actually think about that, kind of showed them that there is differences throughout their day. Some things are helpful, some things are not helpful, but it is different. It's not just a constant pain. Sometimes sitting down really, really helped them. Sometimes sitting down was the worst thing they could possibly do. So for them to kind of differentiate the pain throughout the day was helpful, again, for that thought process of like, I can influence my pain by how I choose to move the body. So they were giving me numbers of sitting, standing, and sleeping. And so, let's see, I've got my little graphs here somewhere. So and the overall pain, of course. So overall pain on the, let's see, group A went from a 4.7 to a 2.5 averaged everything.
Nice.
Which again was great. Like, that's a huge, 4.7 to 2.5 is fantastic. Which is an average of 2.2 in difference, but group B was 4.3 to 1.25. So their difference was 3. So But the biggest thing on that is I had at least 2 of my group B students give me zeros. Like they literally had absolutely no back pain, nothing overall, absolute zeros. And those were the 2 that actually had the longest back pain. They were my 10 years and my 15
Wow.
years back pain. So for them to have a 0, I was seeing stars.
That's
um,
fantastic.
yeah, I was over the moon at just how great their numbers were coming out. And then let's see, for sitting, group A was 4.3 to 2.5, so that averages of 1.8. So even so super low still, because your range is 10. I told them it's your personal 10. 10 is the worst pain that you've ever felt. Sometimes people because think that there's some kind of medically endorsed scale that you have to choose from, because everybody will be like, oh well, I kind of have a high pain tolerance, and I'm like, well, that's not what I'm asking. Or they'll be like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know, it wasn't, I was like, no, 10 is your personal, like, think about the worst pain you've ever been in. So they kind of had to think about that for a while. But group B had an average of 1.8 at the end of it. Group B had a change of 2.38. So a much bigger change relatively in those numbers. And again, a lot of people had zeros in group B from sitting, which was huge for me because most of them had jobs where they had to sit for most of their day.
Yeah.
So to take someone who, imagine I've got to sit for 8 hours and that sitting's going to hurt. I just couldn't imagine the mental challenge it was to just get to work knowing that it was going to be painful. And then I had we had standing. Standing on group A went 4.6 to 2.5, so we had a change of 2.1. But group B went from 4.87 to 1, which was a change of 3.8, which was the highest change in the whole study for any of the groups for that standing. And I really do contribute that to that TVA work, because we queued up mountain pose at least 4 million times during that time and really worked on that idea of TVA. So I had people saying, I could hear you cueing mountain while I was standing at work or while I was,
Nothing
or I was,
creepy about that. Nothing creepy about hearing your yoga teacher's voice
your
in your head.
voice. Right. I could hear your voice saying, hips to ribs and long tailbone. I was like, well, that's good. I'll give you those cues for as long as you need them. And then finally for sleeping, we went from a 3.3 to a 1.8 on group A, which gives you a change of 1.5. And then on group B was 2.5 to 0.87, which is a
Mm-hmm.
change of 1.63. So, and that was also, I had a stunning amount of zeros on the group B. And again, for me, that was enormous, because we all know how important sleep
Yeah.
is for not just the healing process, but for life in
Stress,
general.
hormones,
Oh my gosh.
all the
Well,
stuff.
everything. At the same time that I was doing this, I was reading a book called Why We Sleep, and there's just so much good information about there.
It's a
It almost
dangerous book to read. It is. It's great, but
scares
it is
you into
kind of
sleeping.
scary.
Scares you into sleeping. You're like, oh my god, if I don't sleep, yeah, it's kind of like putting your symptoms into into WebMD. You're going to get something back that's terrifying, and that's kind of what this book is. You start reading, and you're like, but it was eye opening to see how just impaired you can be through sleep. And I know when I had my back pain, I wasn't able to sleep because you couldn't find a comfortable position, regardless if you were sitting in a recliner or laying down. You couldn't get comfortable. So obviously, without that sleep, you're impaired, whether it's driving to work, so that's your own safety and the safety of the people on the road, but also you're not being mindful of your movements. You're not being like, well, if I sit here with my legs crossed, is that going to mess with my low back? Or and you're probably too exhausted to do your homework, your exercises and stuff. So it was just really, really crucial for that sleep component. And we went through, ways to adjust your sleeping position to try to keep the SI joint as neutral as possible. So I was really, really happy to see all those zeros when they were sleeping. So people were getting back to the good kind of sleep that you want.
I love that. And I think there are some really powerful takeaways in that, firstly, both groups improved overall, which is great
Yes.
because you had 8 weeks of people doing dedicated, regular practice of exercises, even if they weren't doing myofascial release, and also being more aware of their posture standing, their posture sitting, their posture sleeping. So both groups showed really good improvements. But the group that had the additional intervention of myofascial release had noticeably higher improvements, especially in their pain when standing and their pain when sleeping. And a lot of them went down to zero, which is absolutely awesome. And I think you snuck another little bit of pain education in there too, right from the outset, by having them compare their pain levels as an overall average and then sitting, standing, and sleeping, because even that process of dissecting their pain experience and noticing that it's not monolithic, that there actually are changes in different positions and changes at different times of day, even that plants the seed for, it's not always this thing, my back. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. And even just knowing that it changes means that there's a potential for it to change on a more long-term basis. That is sneaky pain education right there. I love that.
It is huge, because it becomes all consuming and overwhelming, and all you can think of is the pain. And it is hard to differentiate between when you have something that's maybe not quite so painful. I mean, you're still in pain and your body's still telling you this is not okay. But there are times where it's way more manageable than others. And sometimes you just get caught kind of drowning instead of treading water.
Yeah, I guess my instinct before I learned about pain science was, well, I want to distract people. I want them thinking about anything but the pain because they're thinking about it so much at the time. But the reality is, when you look at it in more detail, when you shine a light on pain and get curious about its edges and its qualities and its intensity and its ebbs and flows, your relationship with it changes. It's like naming Voldemort in Harry Potter. You give it name, you give it form, it stops being this thing that just scares you day after day, and becomes a strange little creature that you can kill. Okay, I should probably leave that analogy aside. So let's reassure everybody that you did in the end give the myofascial release practices to Group A. So once your project was finished, you didn't just leave them to suffer for the rest of their lives. You did share it with them.
No, so when they came in for their exit interview, I shared with them, I was like, after they'd given me all their numbers and everything, I said, by the way, these are the kind of numbers that I'm getting from Group B, and it does seem to suggest that this myofascial release thing that we're doing is actually really, really helpful. So then at that point, we went ahead and went through, specific to them, like what is still hurting you. And then I was a little bit more specific on the myofascial release. I gave them everything. I gave them the whole homework sheet. But specifically during that time that we had together, I might have targeted glute med or psoas or whatever specific because they would talk about what movements were still hurting them. And so we would pick one, and then we would do it just to train them in terms of like, what kind of sensations are we looking for? How are we going to breathe through it? Even, just the positioning of the tennis ball. So just kind of getting them just that little bit of training that all the other students had the very, very first time, especially since most of them had never done myofascial release before or anything close to it. So they got all of that into for that one release. And then I gave them the sheet that had everything. So I said, absolutely go through all of them just as we did before. It's going to be very helpful. But, the one I just gave you, maybe that's the one you start with, because it definitely was the one a little bit more specific to what you're feeling now. But, and all of them afterwards, they definitely left very, very hopeful. Like you could absolutely tell they were a little frustrated. They still had a little bit of niggles of stuff. They were definitely better. And especially when I was giving them numbers, I'm like, do you remember that, like, when I brought you in here, you said this was an 8. And I was like, now you're giving me 2. Like, I understand 2 is still frustrating and 2 is still pain, but it was an 8, So like, to give them those numbers, they that was eye-opening for them, because as you're healing, it's very easy to forget where you came from, because you're still in pain. So to kind of quantify that thing, by the way, you're actually doing so well. So they left very hopeful with that little extra nugget to add on to their homework and to their maintenance plan that we had given everybody.
And I'm really glad you brought that out, because that's another really sneaky piece of pain education, because you're right. we exist in the moment, and any discomfort still ranks in our mind as this thing that's not fixed yet. And there's not a lot of glamour in record keeping as a yoga teacher, but it can really transform people's appreciation of their situation when you say to them, it was an 8 weeks ago, and now it's down to a 2. I know that's not 0. I know that's not perfect, but that's huge progress. And you've done that over the past 8 weeks. Maybe if you continue to do that, the numbers will continue to change, especially if we add in this additional tool. So just reflecting people's experience back to them can be such a powerful thing. And it requires you as a therapeutic yoga teacher to take records, to keep records. Not very glamorous, but it can create these real aha moments for people.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the best things that I do. And I've even had students comment, they're like, I love that you're taking notes, because sometimes when you go to the doctor, you want the doctor to listen to you, but you also want the doctor to remember what you're saying. And sometimes they're just kind of listening and not really taking notes. But when you're actively writing down, oh, this is the pain number, and this is how you feel, and this is better, and they see you taking these records, and then the next time they see me, I'm like, oh, by the way, last time you mentioned this, this, and this, and they're like, oh, I did?
Yeah, I did.
And I was like, yeah, you said it was an 8 and now it's a 3. And they're gonna like, really? I was an 8? And they almost don't believe that they were there at one point, because again, it's so easy to focus on the negative if something is still wrong, as opposed to focusing on the positive of like, yeah, but look how much progress you've made. Like this is definitely a glass half full kind of a moment right now, as opposed to a glass half empty. So, and we definitely worked that into a lot of our shavasanas. Was so much could be going wrong with the body right now, but I want you to think for a moment of what is going right. Like there are millions of things going on that your body's actually doing a pretty good job with. And it's so easy to get bogged down with that negativity of your back pain. So like we did body scans of like, take a moment to be grateful that you are taking these nice deep breaths, and that your shoulders feel good, and that your legs are still carrying you around, and that all these kind of little tidbits of, by the way, percentage wise, if you think about it, your body's doing a pretty good job. And so try not to get bogged down with that small percentage that we're working on right now, and stay positive about the idea that we'll eventually get there.
That's a really powerful addition. And it's something that, you're right, in medical settings, they just don't have the time for. That's not how the system is designed. But it's another great benefit of the space we inhabit, of not being their healthcare provider and not being their medical provider. We have time to do progressive relaxation, and we have time to talk about gratitude and contentment, and to encourage people to acknowledge, one, that there's a million chemical reactions going on in the body at every moment that are going right, that our body is doing the very best it can. And even the thing that is causing us pain or irritation is still the body doing its best to find ways to compensate and to continue moving us forward through our lives. It's only doing the best it can. So to take a moment to give it a little gratitude, good little body for continuing to support me, that's a really powerful thing. And I think it's a lovely place to kind of to start wrapping up the conversation. And I wanted to ask you, you knew going in that myofascial release was probably going to be really helpful. So that perhaps wasn't as much of a revelation for you or for me as it was for the students. But what were your big takeaways from the project, including whether anything kind of came up that surprised you?
I guess my big picture was that I had to differentiate between groups with myofascial release, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I was saying phooey to the strengthening. I'm a massive believer in the strengthening, but I think that the big takeaway was that while both of them were strengthening, I think that's crucial for long-term health. That myofascial release gave that immediate feedback, and that idea that I am not broken. I can do something to fix. And I felt an immediate release. And I felt, things that I haven't felt in years. I felt a shift. I felt, just any kind of that feedback. It was so important that they had this immediately positive attitude of, oh my gosh, maybe I can actually do this. It's the one thing that I've tried that I can enjoy, like doing the homework for. I think with a lot of physical therapy is strength-based, which again, huge component of the long-term health. But, it takes sometimes up to 6 weeks to see a little bit of change in the muscles. So to ask someone to do homework for 6 weeks without any necessarily benefit, or not without big benefits anyway, it's easy to forget your homework, and it's easy to be like, I don't really want to do this today. I'm tired, or like, this isn't helping. I don't really feel any different. Like I'm not in any less pain. Maybe because you didn't have those numbers to kind of work with like we did. But with myofascial release, even if that first 3 minutes that we did, there was an immediate feedback of, we're fixing things, we're changing things. This feels really good. And they wanted to do their homework because they knew that it was helpful, and they had that immediate feedback of, I'm changing things and I'm helping things and I'm feeling better, and you can see the range of motion is better, and you can instantly feel one side's heavier, the quality of the tissues are different. So it just gave that immediate positive feedback, and it was so much easier for them to do their homework, and they were excited about doing their homework. So I think that big takeaway was that while definitely strengthening crucial for the long term. And I will always advocate, you've got to strengthen, you've got to even out, you got to make sure something's not overworking and underworking. That myofascial release really is that instantaneous feedback that we need kind of as humans to be like, oh, I'm not a broken person. Like I can do something about this. This feels good.
I love that takeaway, because I think Tiffany describes it as the process of clearing neurologic static. It's those layers of, in some cases, decades of belief and experience and expectation, and giving the nervous system a taste of something completely novel and completely different. And somehow that starts to dissolve and dissipate those patterns and create the potential for the experience to be different. I think most people who use self-myofascial release have had some kind of experience along those lines. And I love that as a big takeaway. So we have a couple of podcasts that will be helpful if this conversation was helpful for listeners. We've got one on pain science and pain care with Dr. Marnie Hartman. I'll link to that. We've got one on low back pain and the importance of strength, stability, movement optimism, the role that myofascial release can play with myself, Tiffany, and Yenny Tama. I'll link to that. We've also got one on the kind of myofascial release foundations with Tiffany. I will link to that. But where would you send people who want to know more about you and what you do specifically?
So my studio is Limitless Yoga Studio. We're based here in Wichita, Kansas. So you can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook. We have our website, limitlessyogastudio.com. So absolutely join us on social media, and hopefully get some helpful information from us.
Great. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes for all those of you who are interested. And I just want to wrap up by saying thank you very much for sharing your experience with us and for giving all of those little nuggets of information. And a huge congratulations on completing your 1,000-hour qualification.
Thank you again. It was my honor to share all that knowledge and contribute, hopefully, to someone else getting a little bit better.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.